Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Alan Kooi Davis and Rafael Lancelotta. Alan is a psychology professor clinical psychology professor at Ohio State and has been part of the Hopkins team for quite a while and is very fluent in the current psychedelic research landscape. We get a little bit more into the intro in the podcast, and Rafael Lancelotta is a legal psychedelic therapist operating out of Innate Path in Lakewood, Colorado. It's like the Denver metro region. And he does work with cannabis and ketamine and has a really great skill set. He's been on the show before. Hopefully you remember him. He runs this website, The 5 Hive. It's kind of 5meodmt.org maybe. If you just search The 5 Hive on Google, you'll find it. But it's a great 5MEO-DMT website, forum, and resource for people interested in that drug in particular. In this episode, we get into some issues with the 5MEO-DMT world, and I think it's a really special episode. So I hope you like it. Have any feedback? Let us know. Psychedelics Today email at gmail.com, or you can just join our Facebook group and let us know. It's over at psychedelicstodaygroup.com. And I think that's it for the intro about the show. I really enjoyed this. We got to record it at Naropa in Boulder, beautiful campus, and it was the first time I got to do anything official at Naropa, and don't think it's going to be the last time. I'm really, really hoping the folks at Naropa will have me, and I just need to start kind of coordinating some stuff with them. So if you are interested in psychedelic education, we have an amazing package. It is called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. It is professional grade psychedelic education, and we are running courses starting in February, some 8-week courses. Check it out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com, and you can learn all about the program. So it's 8 weeks of live supported conversations with us and other students you're studying with, going through our Navigating Psychedelics curriculum and masterclasses that are built out for you specifically as clinicians and therapists. This material isn't necessarily relevant to the general audience who's, festival people or like psychonauts, but it is specifically targeted for clinical audiences. We're working on continuing ed credits. We don't have those available yet, but we are working on announcing those. I would say if you're interested in this education, do the course anyway. It will serve you well. We've been told that we compare favorably to the CIIS training, and it's, not the same thing. You certainly don't have to go on an airplane and travel somewhere, but you get to study from the comfort of your own home or wherever you're at. So hopefully it works for you. Check it out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Masterclasses from tons of clinicians all over the psychedelic landscape, and plenty more masterclasses and an amazing base curriculum focusing on harm reduction, various models and frameworks for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, psychiatric theory, kind of like Stan Groff's work and more. So check it out. Again, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Hope you at least take a peek, and I think that's it for now. Here's the interview with Rafael Lancelotta and Alan Kooi Davis. Thanks. I'm here at Naropa in Boulder with Alan Davis and Rafael Lancelotta. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I'm really excited about this because I've been thinking a lot about 5-MeO-DMT. I still haven't done it, kind of on conscience, but for a few other reasons too. But I'm pretty sure you two know more about it than anybody else I know because I haven't met too many. I've kind of on purpose not met too many people into 5-MeO-DMT for a few reasons as well. And I'm sure we'll get into that later, but we've had you on the show before, Rafael. Could you kind of give us a rough 2-minute sketch, and I'll tell people to go listen to the episode with you in it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the short version is that we met a while back, a few years ago, and just talked a little bit about, what interested me about 5-MeO-DMT and some of the work that I'd done so far, and just kind of a little bit of personal stuff about myself, and yeah.
And you studied something at Cheyenne. Was it psychology, mental health counseling?
Yeah, okay. In Laramie.
Cool, Laramie, not Cheyenne. Yeah. Cheyenne's kind of podunk. But
I think they're all
Laramie's
the same places in Laramie.
I used to actually mountain bike right outside Cheyenne a whole bunch, but I never made it over to Laramie.
Cool.
Yeah, one time I even went there and forgot my shoes and just biked in sandals. Terrible idea with all the cactus everywhere. Don't do it. And now you're at Innate Path doing cannabis and ketamine assisted psychotherapy.
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah, that's in Lakewood. Listeners should know about Innate Path. We talk about it a fair amount. And Alan, thank you for joining us. You are a psychologist at Ohio State now, previously at Johns Hopkins.
Yes, correct. And still on the faculty at Hopkins as well, working remotely with the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. But my training is primarily as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, but mostly my work right now involves clinical research. So interested in psychoactive substances and broadly speaking, the way in which they can be beneficial for people and sometimes harmful for some people, and kind of the dynamic interactions between the two.
Awesome. I saw your talk in New York. That was really cool.
Thank you.
I was really happy to see all your names on it. Rafael, Malene, a number of other folks I don't even know. I think Nathan Cepeda, he's been on the show as well.
Yeah, and Annie Ortiz has been
Annie,
involved with those projects. And
I'm still trying to get her on the show.
You should.
She's like just poking her head out of the turtle shell a little bit, but I think we'll get her on soon. Good. I really was trying to get her to contribute to this 5-MeO DMT class that we were putting together. She hasn't. We did 1 or 2 recordings, but I think they were great, but she had some issues. So eventually we'll get it on there. So now let's get into 5-MeO DMT. A natural source is this Bufo various toad, which is potentially going to be under tremendous pressure. Well, already is kind of under a fair amount of pressure. And how do you all describe this drug? It's a really weird drug. Some people say it's not even a psychedelic. It's stranger than that. Like, how do you like to talk about this drug?
Wow. When I talk to, I'll start off by how I describe it to my mother. When I talk to someone like my mother, who is always interested, but maybe not so knowledgeable on psychedelics, what they are, I always just describe it as a very fast acting and powerful psychedelic substance that creates an experience that is wide in scope, but also very challenging to predict, and that there's a lot of potential for people to have amazing, beautiful, wonderful, transcendent experiences, and also a lot of room for error in terms of bringing about really challenging experiences for people, and potentially even traumatic ones. So I think that's a pretty broad lens, but I'm curious to hear what Rafael has to say about it.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Fast-acting, powerful psychedelic. I think that one thing that sets it apart from other psychedelics that are maybe considered classical psychedelics is it tends to not have as much of the kind of colorful, geometry kind of thing that's typically associated with what a psychedelic is, with a swirly fractal type experience. And seems to be something that's a lot more rooted in the consciousness itself. And so I think in some ways it could be considered very weird, but also weirdly familiar.
A lot of people say like love, and I finally felt comfortable at home, and weird, strange things that people don't usually say about acid, but could sometimes.
We hear a lot of reports too, I think, in our qualitative part of our research, where people describe, being shot right into the center of love, or right into the center of consciousness in the universe. And so in some ways it does at least have this cosmology surrounding it that seems to point to people perceiving it as kind of the ultimate experience of direct connection to some type of mystical state, whatever you want to call that, whatever words you want to put around that. And so now, whether that's empirically true, who knows at this point in the scientific investigation of it, but that's what a lot of people are saying about it. And so it's curious in that way, because I think, as Rafael was saying, not having as much of the visual kind of landscape piece of the psychedelic experience, it seems like it's, other psychedelics that act perhaps differently on different, receptor sites in the brain may be creating an experience that's kind of near or around or touching or sometimes dipping into that kind of experience, but maybe not going to the core that a lot of the people who have had the 5-MeO DMT experience describe.
Often I tell people that I'm just talking to in passing, like, hey, this is very different from what you would call normal DMT, which I don't even know how to even make the differentiation in language anymore, because apparently they're both NN-DMT, but slightly different. I don't even know how to say normal DMT anymore, so I just say normal DMT like a dummy. But, yeah, like you're saying, this very wild visual landscape, very immersive visually. And then with 5-MeO DMT, it's like more of a dissolution into something, like the rocket ship or just being shot into the heart of love is one way of thinking of it, or like dissolving into perhaps like all of the universe at one go. Like, these are things I've heard. So
Sure.
Yeah, we hear a lot of people say things like becoming one with the universe or becoming one with God or some type of mystical, however they describe that spiritual component. And so I think that it is very different than NN-DMT in that way, at least, from the acute subjective reports that we see in different studies. There's a whole different sense of like with quote unquote regular DMT entity encounters, for example, and kind of having these experiences of like some kind of discarnate, kind of separate thing that you can have like a communication with, where there is still like a duality of like a you and a something else in the experience, which is so different than the reports from the 5-MeO research of kind of complete immersion into, where there isn't necessarily that same separateness of the experience.
There
kind of
seems to
are
be
the experience.
Right. There seems to be a difference in terms of the observer of, merging with the observer versus having an observer to see this alien landscape or meet an entity. There's still, I think in a lot of those reports, like the NN-DMT reports, there's that sense of other, whereas I think the sense of other seems to dissolve or to merge in a lot of the reports that people have said with 5-MeO.
Cool. So, Alan, you presented at Horizons and covered kind of positive and negative aspects of 5-MeO use and culture. And I'm hoping we can get a little bit into that and kind of talk about those power dynamics and abuse of power and, whatever else. So, there's a couple of Voldemorts in the room that I don't really like naming, so we can skip naming them. But, what kind of, yes, there's a lot of positive, but I don't really know that we need to go there. But can you kind of share a little bit about like what you've seen in the field from reports and the negative end?
Of course. The thing when I was approached by the folks at Horizons to do that talk and they wanted it to be on 5-MeO DMT, I agreed, but my stipulation is that I would not only talk about the positives, because so far, so much of the work that's been out there, so much of the messaging that is reported is on the positives only, and there is a potential for harm. And in fact, there are quite a few reports now, not only reports that are unsubstantiated, but some substantiated reports now kind of documenting through video and other types of media some of the harms that are occurring. Not to mention, as Rafael and I have been working on this line of research, getting contacted by people in the community who are reporting these directly to us now, because we're seen, I think, in some ways as someone who's a safe person to contact related to their problems. And that's been, I think, the biggest challenge I have as a scientist and as a clinical psychologist is how do I balance the power and privilege of my position in ensuring that the work that we're putting out there isn't putting people in harm because they're seeing us report on some of these positive things and wanting to go out and try it themselves and maybe not knowing who to trust and what to do to be safe and how to be safe with this molecule. So, and more importantly, with the people around them who are providing this molecule to them.
Yeah, I think similarly to Alan, being contacted in a variety of ways, but on the 5-MeO DMT forum that I've put together, there's people that come on there all the time that are struggling to integrate really big experiences, maybe have had experiences with facilitators who have said, you need to do it 3 days in a row, and each day we're going to do a bigger dose, or people who have, done escalating doses, and for them, they're having whiteout experiences that feel completely unintegratable, but the facilitator is telling them you need to take more because that's how this works. So I think hearing about things like that and start getting contact with ways in which this can be used in ways that can really be harmful to people. I think that there's a variety of dimensions of potential harm. I think that pharmacologically it's a relatively safe compound, but I think that a lot of the harms emerge from context of use. They emerge from the dosage levels that are used, the environments in which they're used in, and then the various protocols that people are using them in. So I think, we talk about harm reduction or benefit enhancement, and from the data that we found, the more things that people put in place to kind of reduce harm or to help them have a safer environment, safer experiences, the more positive the benefits have been. But, when those pieces aren't in place, people tend to have greater challenging experiences, more difficulty integrating. And so then, some of the harms are in the psychological realm, whether it's, a sudden loss of meaning, where like the ontology of the world just seems totally absurd, and not really having much of a community or a support system that, number one, could prepare someone for something like that, but also to then receive someone on the back end, because especially a lot of times, working so much with trauma, there's a lot of things that maybe people have lost awareness of. They're not fully aware of how much something may have impacted them, or is just waiting to come up. And so when those things kind of spring up unexpectedly, it puts people in a really difficult position. And oftentimes that's where we see, at least I've seen, a lot of the harms emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just echo that. I think that's certainly what our data is showing, is that the supportive context is really important in reducing the challenges. And some of those challenges are things that could be therapeutic in the right context. So like one of the things that's reported from people is kind of feeling like they died, and kind of that ego death sense. And that can be really, in some contexts, and some people, that can be really transformative. But in the wrong context, with the wrong people, without an ability to integrate and make sense of that experience, when it's really powerful, and when you have such a strong experience like that, then there is potential for long-term harm. I mean, I've heard from people contacting me who have ended up just going to the emergency department, who have ended up, getting put on antipsychotics and anti-anxiety medications because they were traumatized by that experience and did not have the support from some of these folks who are giving this medicine out in the community to be able to make sense of that. And especially when you think about the number of folks who, at least it seems like, aren't doing kind of standard things that you would think about in terms of safety, like dosing people appropriately and ensuring that they have the right preparation. And when that's not done, this issue of basically traumatizing people with an experience like this, I think, is unfortunately a profound challenge.
One of the things that I wonder too is about the way that, some of these facilitators are conceptualizing the work with the medicine. If they're conceptualizing it within like a shamanic lens and applying it into a Western framework, I mean, we live in a very different world, and our relationship to our minds and to the world is vastly different from, what the shamanic traditions would say. And so, someone operating from within that kind of lens, or whatever lens they're using, and you have folks that may be seeking it out from a Western perspective, and maybe they've been working with their mental state within that Western framework, then the goals of the facilitator may be a bit misaligned with the goals of the people who are approaching them. So I think that there's some of those things, right, where, like you said, there's some obvious things that maybe as a clinician one would screen for or pay attention to, that someone else may completely not see or not catch, that could potentially have prevented something down the road.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is the idea of this type of psychedelic substance being somehow appropriated into a shamanic lineage or understanding that doesn't actually have proof for the existence of. And so it's kind of like Western people deciding that there's going to be some type of shamanic process with this specific psychedelic, even though there isn't that history and lineage, at least not documented with the toad, certainly. And so I think it just calls into question, people who kind of self-aggrandize their own experience of being emerged with God or with the universe or with love or whatever they want to call it, and then personally anointing themselves to go be some kind of messenger or shamanic healer for others. And I'm not saying that all of those people who might have that desire or experience are necessarily doing bad things, but perhaps some of those folks who may have predisposing factors that increase the risk involved with kind of believing more about their role in that process is what's maybe perhaps creating some of this harm.
I'll give an example of a really kind of negative scenario that one of these road warriors put together. And he was traveling from, Southwest all the way to this 2017 psychedelic conference. And the plan was to facilitate for a whole bunch of folks 5-MeO DMT, allegedly. Apparently, he didn't know where his stash was or if it was still there in the bay, and was going to have these people smoke 4-ACO DMT instead of 5-MeO DMT. And thankfully, at the very last minute, his stash was still there. And he provided them with toad venom, in the typical overdose fashion. So a lot of these facilitators actually way overdose because toad venom's not super predictable for content of 5-MeO DMT. So.
Right. Not only is that, but I don't think I've said this directly to Rafael yet, but the last couple of weeks I've been really trying to consider what implications there are in the type of experience someone's going to have specifically with toad venom when the whole manufacturing biologically of that in the toad species and the extraction of it essentially involves a traumatization of an animal. Like that fear response that has to be induced in order for them to release that venom seems to me like something that could really, bring some challenge in that process of like what kind of stuff is going on to even get to the point where someone can have that kind of experience, having caused a trauma.
I think it would be like cortisol, and other weird hormones.
Right.
But I don't know enough about toads to come up with an analogy there.
And I don't either. Maybe Rafael does.
Perfect.
Well, in terms of the analysis of the toad venom, which has, I've talked to a few, I know Malin has done some analysis over in Czech Republic, and there's been some analysis done here, but the content of 5-MeO DMT is actually much higher than what was previously seen. So we're seeing, up to like 20% of the toad venom is 5-MeO DMT. And so...
Is that an up to number?
Sorry?
Is that an up to 20% or roughly?
Yeah, roughly. I mean, I think some could be even higher, but I would say on average about 20. Cool. And that's a bit higher than what was previously thought. It was more like 10% to 15%. 15 was considered top. So a lot of the dosing is based on this idea that, it's 15% of this. So I think that's one aspect is that,
kind of accounts for how people say, no, toad venom's better. Like just because they're getting potentially a much higher dose.
Sure. I mean, if people are saying, well, toad is more powerful, I mean, it may be just because you're taking so much more of it. I mean, in terms of the cortisol and that kind of thing, I think, my understanding about the harvesting of it is, I would imagine it would be a bit stressful for the toads to be like grabbed and handled like that. I know that the glands are actually squeezed, so they're not like traumatizing the toad until it squirts out the venom. But I think even the act of squeezing those glands, I mean, I wouldn't want someone squeezing my nose or something to collect my snot or something like that.
Well, what's traumatic though? Like you're being hunted essentially.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's stressful.
Yeah. I mean, that in itself, right?
When a fox come and eats you, you're stressed out.
And also there's a lot of reports of alien abductions where people are reporting being probed and prodded that are pretty traumatic for them, even if, there wasn't other things involved in it. So
have you ever read John Mack?
Mm-mm.
He's a Harvard psychiatrist who studied that phenomenon quite a bit. He was a student of Groff or friend of Groff, and he wrote a number of books about it and just treating it as they report it. Like, okay, it happened. We don't have to worry about it, but we'll work on it as if it happened. Interesting field. But yeah, totally. I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. I was just, I think that even though it may not be like the same kind of issue that, for example, like eating meat from an animal that's been stressed before they are killed, I think that still, like, there is a traumatization process that's happening with these animals. And I think that kind of goes back to that idea of what things are being overlooked in order for that experience to happen.
Right. And kind of back to the theme of power and privilege. Like, as humans, we tend to assume we have the rights to take what we want, whether or not it harms another creature. And in this case, it seems pretty apparent to me that that power is kind of overriding a lot of people in that part of the community right now. Really for no reason. And that's what I think is the big scientific point that I wanted to make, is that when we compare the acute reports of synthetic 5-MeO DMT that's used in the same way, meaning the same kind of like ceremonial fashion with the right supportive context and the right care for preparation and integration, to toad venom used in the same way, there is no statistical difference in the acute subjective effects of these two different experiences. And so that doesn't mean there aren't differences, but it means that at least scientifically, there's no justification for assuming that toad venom is somehow better. And if that's not true, if we're not seeing that, then the evidence is actually pointing us towards why go down this path of potentially creating harm to another species if you don't have to.
I think it's religious. I think we're seeing the formation of new religions.
Yeah.
And
for
if
some
they
people,
survive or not,
sure.
That's another thing. But yeah, I totally think there's these
certainly
guys.
Some of the leaders in that would absolutely, I think, want to make that claim.
Yeah.
Actually, some of them are like literally making churches.
Yeah, there are some literal churches. And I think it is interesting to see how, an experience where someone becomes one with everything. Right, let's just assume that maybe that's the kind of the impetus for a lot of this. Integrating that when an ego structure comes back online, there's all kinds of discrepancies that one has to account for, right? So, number one, if I'm one with everything, then I'm also experiencing the suffering of everything, and there's kind of two routes that can. There's many routes, but two main ones that I see. One of which is there's suffering happening anyway, and it's all for a greater purpose, and that I can then piggyback off of that greater purpose and justify further suffering for this greater purpose. Another route is seeing the great amounts of suffering and truly understanding it and experiencing it, and having a very strong desire to minimize as much suffering as possible, and that being more in line with the greater purpose, right? The idea of oneness, right? So, because the thing with oneness is that there is no thing to do. It's not within that state. There isn't like a desire. There aren't entities that have agendas, that have knowledge and want to move energy and do the thing. With oneness, it's simply being. And so when we doing beings are confronted with non-doing and non-duality, when we come back to a doing world, the question then arises: now what do I do? And I think that in light of that, then it can, when this experience is had without, a context or without a specific intention, right? Like if the intention is simply, I just want to be able to have this experience. I'm not going to use this experience to then go and do something. I'm going to use this experience just to see what's there or to feel my emotions or whatever. Then when the rational mind comes back online, then there's this, okay, well, I have to make sense of it. And when I make sense of it, then I'm going to take some action. And so I think using it within different contexts allows for a different way of integrating that kind of thing.
And I think my bias, and I'll call it a bias because I'm a clinician, and so my bias is to think about pathology and problems and mental health. But my bias is also part of that to assume that a piece of that context for people has to involve their own psychological makeup prior to having the experience. And so whatever they're bringing into that experience with them based on their personality features and their history and the way they view the world and their self-concept of their place in the world, that when that reintegrates, when that comes back online after the experience, I think that's where the potential for when there's not a context and there's not solid, integration capacity, then it's really easy to just assume like, oh, I am God. I just had that experience. That must be true.
Well, and especially if it's a really beautiful, ecstatic experience, one wants that to be true, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's very few people, I think, who have gone to hell realms who come back and say, yeah, that was meant for me.
Right. The problem is that people can believe it's true, and it might be true, but what they forget is so is everyone else. Because if it truly is a oneness, then you are no different, and no one is different than you. And I think that's where some of that personality feature approach to thinking about hierarchy or being different than or better than or somehow superior to, can kind of muddy up the waters in terms of that interpretation.
I like this analogy that Carl Sagan says, like, we're all stardust, and it's this beautiful idea, and it's like, well, so is trash. Right. So I think it is important to, like, yeah, it's cool that we're one with the universe, but so is everything else. Right. So
I want to steer us back to an intention we had at the beginning to talk about power and privilege. And I always have a complicated relationship to this topic because I want to get into the nuts and bolts and really understand it, and it's hard to do that. So, what can you give us, Al, an example of maybe? Do you have like a cornerstone example of power and privilege and how it could negatively affect psychedelic users or the community? Big question.
Big question. Yeah, big question.
You can take small bites too. Yeah. It's okay.
Well, I think the first bite I'll take is just thinking about what power and privilege means to me. And I think power and privilege to me in the psychedelic space, and even more broadly speaking in my profession and in my family and in my personal life and in my friendships, I think power and privilege comes down to having voice and having opportunity and having some things that are acquired and earned, but also some things that are just attributed based on a lot of different factors, like sex and gender and race and ethnicity and position in society and which society you're in. And I think in psychedelic spaces right now, there has been such a long history of stigmatization of that community and of these experiences. And there, for so many decades, there was a difficulty in being open and finding voice. And now, as we've, I think emerged into what some are calling, a renaissance period, certainly for psychedelic science, but even more importantly, thinking about the emergence and the evolution of our communities around substances more broadly, around cannabis use and the openness to that and the destigmatization of that. And, most of my family has come from Washington and Colorado, and there was definitely a change in, going home for the holidays and seeing the way that communities were changing after legalization and how conversations around cannabis changed and who has power in that space and how is that negotiated and how is that attributed, especially in a capitalistic framework. And, I think we're seeing the early stages of that with psychedelics, and it's even, I think, more pronounced because of the scientific piece of it. The people in the science communities have such a voice, a loud voice. They have connections to media and institutional privilege and these spaces where that work, for better or worse, gets put on a pedestal. And I think that for myself, reconciling my position in that world and reconciling my connection and ability to transmute some of that power and privilege and find ways to be in an environment where that exists and where I have that, but also finding my understanding of what it means to create a system wherein other people can get access to it. Because I think that the real danger is that people without voices and who lack the power, who are really kind of building things in community that are really important for the manifestation of any of this to work, frankly. I mean, the clinical things that we're investigating at the scientific level are not going to work in community unless the people in community not doing science are building vocabulary and connections and conversations with people in those communities, with stakeholders in diverse communities who are really struggling with the very conditions that we're trying to find solutions for with psychedelics. And so these worlds have to connect. And I think that part of that connection is realizing how to use power and privilege in productive ways, but also figure out like how to reconnect power and privilege to get other people to the table to have a voice. Now I've been rambling. So
and you're doing that with Source Research Foundation by enabling students to come to the table and share their opinions and worldviews and
basically all of those thoughts pre being able to speak them out loud were the inspiration for Source Research Foundation and trying to find a way, really from my own experience, and I know Rafael's experience as well, being students trying to figure out how to have a path in this professional space without really any clear paths available to us. And for so many other students now in that same place right now, trying to find a way to bridge those problems and to create path and to create connection. I think that if we're going to be successful with this process more broadly in the psychedelic communities, then we have to listen to the effects that these substances are bringing about in individuals and in communities. And I think a big piece of that is the theme of connection. And so we have to look at how do we connect people into these processes and use power and privilege in order to leverage that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. When speaking about power and privilege is the use of it, right? Because there are things that, like you said, sometimes power and privilege are attributed, and it's not something that someone necessarily asks for. But then there is a certain responsibility then to use that power and privilege, like you said, to leverage others who may not have had that attribution and who also have incredibly significant things to contribute. So yeah, I think that piece really resonates. And I think also the kind of tracing through the history of the psychedelic culture, community, now that because it was kind of this underground and persecuted thing, right? Simply being connected to psychedelics in some way was kind of put in a position of persecution. But now that it's being, brought to light and the dynamics, simply identifying as, a psychedelics user, it's not the same kind of stigma that it was before, at least in some places, not everywhere. But I think within this so-called psychedelic renaissance, I think there are these imbalances that have to be looked at. I think that I have heard in the past that in some circles, there's this idea, psychedelics tell us that we're all one, so we don't need to look at power indifferences because we're all the same. And I think that the potential to bypass some of those things, especially when one is in a position of power and has that privilege, it's so easy to overlook the fact that it's there. And it's so much easier to just be like, yeah, well, we live in a wonderful world. And like, if you don't think that it's wonderful, then you probably just need to like meditate more or, eat some more mushrooms. When really, I think this psychedelic renaissance is potentially an opportunity to look at the systemic issues that are perpetuating not just problems, I think, in psychedelics, but I liked also the idea of just looking at broader drug use, because I think that there's also the ability for there to be that kind of separation of saying, well, psychedelics are, people who use psychedelics are good, but people who use other drugs are bad.
Or people who use certain psychedelics are good,
right?
And not others.
Sure.
Dr. Hart at Horizons gave a very impassioned talk on this subject. And I think that's a critical thing that we need to think about going forward is how do we even leverage power and privilege across an entire community against other communities within the psychedelic community. Dr. Alicia Danforth is someone who I've had a fortunate experience of getting to spend some time with. And she always kind of brings up the question, which really prompted my evolution, kind of starting to really grapple with some of these questions in my own life. But she has, this statement of kind of questioning, are you entering into this community? Are you wanting to be in this community? What power do you want? How is that power driven? Why are you searching for it? Thinking about what is the voice that you're looking for? What is driving that desire? Is it to be of service? Is it to connect and give back? Is it to somehow find a path to create that connection? Or is it for some other purpose and reason? Are you looking to be a psychedelic rock star, or are you looking to be a connector and a bridger and a solver and a fixer? Like, what are the things that are driving your own needs? And I think that at a basic level, certainly in my work as a psychedelic therapist on the trials at Hopkins, working with people with mental health and going into those experiences with an expressed intention to be of service in that way, but then seeing people who have the experience also discover these capacities for deep empathy and giving and connection. And it seems to me like understanding our own basic values and how these behaviors in this community are either in line with that value or not in line with that value. And at another level, how much those values are in line or not with the community. And for that matter, what are the community values?
So that's the other question that I find myself asking is, what is the community, right? Because I think that it's such, the community it's such a broad term, and is it the psychedelic research community? Is it the Grateful Dead community? Is it the festival goers? Is it shamanic practitioners? Is it psychonauts? I mean, there's so many, and there's so many people in between that don't fit into any of those categories, right? I mean, there's people who live quote unquote regular, normal lives who also use psychedelics. So when we talk about community too, it's like, I don't feel like there's necessarily a container for the quote unquote community in the way that maybe that existed during more prohibitionist times or when pre-Renaissance, so to speak. I think that there was a natural container for that quote unquote community, because you had a small group of intellectuals and people who, really felt so passionate that they were willing to risk persecution to engage with these materials. And now there isn't that container. It's a much more vast container. So I think too, like in having these conversations, and I think it's important to have a better sense of what we're referring to and how we can address the community and the communities that make it up. When you're doing things, are you working to bridge gaps or broaden gaps? Like, I unfortunately keep getting into fights all over the place about a lot of this stuff, and it's unfortunate. Like, I'm really team Carl Hart. Like, this drug policy thing, the scheduling system is junk, and it's hurting a lot of people. And like, just because you use ayahuasca doesn't mean you're better than somebody who doesn't have access and only has been able to use crack and PCP. Like, you're not a better person. You're just a person. Yeah.
And frankly, you both might be searching for the same thing.
Yeah. Yes. Like Carl Hart's slide is, drugs just largely make you feel better. Like, the number one effect, it makes you feel different. And largely, if it's the drug you like, it makes you feel the way you want to feel.
Yeah. And they're really great at it. They all work pretty well to do that, to change that experience of whatever it is that you're feeling or whatever it is that you're searching for.
Do you know if that video's out yet?
I haven't seen it come out yet, but hopefully it'll come out soon.
Mind blowing.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very powerful. I encourage everyone to check it out. To bring this back a little bit to some of the 5-MeO DMT specific implications, is I think one of the reasons why we're living at a time where some of these nefarious characters can exist and have the power and privilege that they have right now within this community is precisely because we don't yet have a really defined sense of what are our values in this or many communities within this space. I keep trying to remind myself this is probably psychedelic communities and not just one psychedelic community. But what are the values? If it's the 5-MeO DMT community, what are those values, and how is their behavior in line or not with those values? And And if they're not in line with the shared values of, for example, safety, consent, rights of persons to monitor their own bodies, up to and including not being killed as a result of an experience, if we kind of think that those are probably basic shared values in this community, then what types of social sanctions should exist within that community to ensure that people are acting in accordance with those values? I think that's ultimately what drives most communities to create a sense of belonging and a sense of shared safety and a monitoring socially of people who aren't acting in coordination with those values.
And I think one of the challenges, though, of when we're talking about, let's say, the 5-MeO DMT community, is what delineates membership. Who is, you can't, a lot of that isn't really something that's observable, right? I like to think of like the EDM community, right? Because that, we can define that by saying, the EDM community consists of people who attend EDM events. And within that community, there are
electronic dance music for folks who don't know.
Sure. There's certain drugs that are used, and within that community, there are certain understandings of, right, there's certain values and all that. With 5-MeO DMT use, I feel like it's a bit trickier because there's not necessarily, a central gathering place or a non-hierarchical setting in which people are kind of showing up to be able to delineate these values. And I think that may be one of the challenges of why, in some circles there are strong core values, and then in other circles there aren't really any. Mm-hmm. And also these different, these different communities have different agendas, right? Like some of them have, more of an outreach agenda, while others have more of an internal agenda. And so, I think just to kind of add to what you're saying and maybe even posing more of a question of, how might we work with some of these challenges in communities?
And I think a piece of the challenge, at least in my own kind of reconciling of my role in this world and in this community is first and foremost understanding what my personal values are. If you don't have a good sense of what your personal values are, then it's really difficult to share that with others and to have conversations about what that means and what that looks like and how to co-create spaces that are leaning on those values as part of the driving mission. So for example, with Source Research Foundation, our values of connection and inspiration kind of guide our entire programmatic landscape, how we go about having conversations with each other, how we go about building programs and like trying to offer things to other people. And I think having that as, almost like a North Star seems like a really positive opportunity, but without any of that developed yet, finding a common starting place for something. I'm reminded of something that Dr. Kat McLean mentioned one time at a conference. She's like, can't we all just start off by agreeing that like people shouldn't be raped in psychedelic communities, or like, people should have respect and opportunity to like feel safe. Like, just starting off there with like basic kind of human rights seems like a decent place. And then kind of building from there on the overall mission in whatever community you happen to find yourself in.
So just pointing out that you only have a moment left, unfortunately, for this recording session. Mm-hmm. Do you want to kind of close up with any thoughts in particular? I liked what you did there. That was pretty cool. And yeah, of course, like let's start with some no-brainers.
Mm-hmm. I would just say that, I feel really grateful and privileged for my connection to this world. And I hope that through my professional work that I can continue to connect and inspire people to have these kinds of conversations. And I'll do whatever I can in my power to continue having these conversations, specifically in the 5-MeO DMT world, because I think that it's really critical there. It's critical all over the psychedelic space right now, but it's, I think, really important there because of the things that we're hearing about and seeing going on. But just really appreciative of being able to have a voice today and to be able to talk.
Yeah, likewise. Really happy and appreciative of the opportunity that I was asked to join on this. And I think likewise, I think for me, one of the areas that I feel really passionate about going forward in is figuring out more ways to make this kind of therapy accessible for people who may benefit from it, who want to. And I think figuring out ways that, you know, this can be integrated into our culture in a way that doesn't only serve those who are in positions of power and privilege, but also can serve those who deserve to be empowered and deserve to live fulfilling lives that may otherwise be more difficult. So, yeah, I think for me that's my big inspiration and takeaway from this, and hopefully I can also continue to contribute in those community discussions.
Cool. Well, I hope we can do this again on the internet.
Absolutely.
It would actually be cool to do, you know, us three again, maybe in a month or two.
Okay.
See what happens in the new year.
Yeah.
So thank you both. I really appreciate your time. And what's the website for Source?
SourceResearchFoundation.org. We're accepting donations and or any other type of contribution of time, talent, passion, whatever you want to offer to the process. We'll take it.
Graphic designers, welcome. All right. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there you have it. Alan Davis and Rafael Lancelotta. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Please do check them out online. Their work is important. They are putting out academic papers that are getting peer review and all that jazz on 5-MeO, DMT, and sometimes even more. So again, Rafael's at Innate Path and Alan's at Ohio State and is attached to Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Center still. So please continue to follow those guys. They're going to be making a big impact. And I really hope I get to do part 2 with them online soon. And yeah, thanks for listening. If you want to deepen your professional psychedelic education, check us out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We've got some free classes there. Most importantly, a live supported 8-week course called Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. It is professional grade education for you. And it is an 8-week live supported program. You've got live online meetings, 8 different hour-and-a-half meetings with us on Zoom, which is kind of like Skype, but a little different, probably a little better. And we've got a secret Facebook group, got a Slack group that you can join to discuss in real time all of these things with us. So in between classes, you can ask questions of Kyle and I and your classmates and much more. So check out our offer over at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We hope you enjoy it. And I think that's it for now. Thank you all for listening. Maybe throw us a review on iTunes or Facebook. We'd love that, or on your iPhone. But yeah, really hope you enjoy the show, and we'll see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today from Breckenridge, Colorado. Bye-bye.